All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Thursday. Um, Without a doubt, you've seen the news that we will be online for the rest of the school year now. So we begin sort of pivoting to that. As I get new information, I'll share it with you. I don't really think that Cobb County Schools has got a lot of information that they're ready to go out public until after spring break. So we'll finish out this week, and we'll probably have some announcements after spring break to give you some more definitive news as to what the rest of the school year online is going to look like. So just be patient on that, and next week, of course, enjoy your spring break. For today, we've been talking about how industrialization and just like the industrial process is such an important thing to countries because realistically speaking, past and present, industry has facilitated improvements in standards of living. It's also, of course, contributed to uneven development around the world as well. But when it comes to understanding how a country develops, whether it's due to industry or something else, what measurements, what data pieces do we actually have in place in order to understand social development, economic development within a country? So that's what we're going to begin looking at today, and we'll take it into tomorrow. And actually, after spring break, we'll continue with this a little bit more as well. When one is trying to measure and get like a good idea of a country's social and economic development, there's some classic measurement pieces, of course, that are that are out there that we've been using for a very long time. In the 1960s, when we're trying to really get a good measurement of economic welfare, the most common way of comparing development and economic welfare was to use the index that economists called the GNP, which stands for Gross National Product. What GNP basically is it's the total value of the officially recorded goods and services produced by the citizens and corporations of a country within a given year. So, total value of goods and services produced in a country within a given year is a country's GNP. It includes things produced both inside and outside a country's territory. So it's a little bit more of a broader measurement than the term or the measurement GDP, which we also use, and some also use the gross domestic product. But the only thing with gross domestic product is it only encompasses goods and services produced within a country. GNP looks at things within and without. I'm sorry, that didn't really make any sense. Looks at things produced within a country and outside a country. That makes a little bit more sense. More recently, though, GNI, which is gross national income, GNI per capita has become a little bit more of a better measurement of economic development. It's increasingly more popular because it calculates the monetary worth of what's produced within a country plus investments from outside the country as well. So it's a very, very accurate way of measuring wealth. Of course, we measure GNI, gross national income, per capita so that we can see how that GNI, how that dollar amount is divided across an entire population, right? In India has an incredibly high GNI, but when you divide it across 1.3 billion people, the average income of people look quite a bit less, as you can see from this map that's on your screen, than say elsewhere in the world, right? But that's what you do. You take the GNI, again, the monetary worth of what's produced within a country plus investments from outside, and then you divide it across the total population, right, to get an idea of what the average person's income is. And that's what GNI per capita is. In Japan, it's about $35,000. In the U.S., the most recent statistic I saw was a little over 55,000 a year. In India, it's around 3,000. Okay, so you're looking at at a smaller average income there. In Nigeria, it's about 2,000 a year that the average person makes. So you can see the contrast between rich and poor a lot better when you do GNI per capita. One of the other ways, of course, that we measure development as well that's pretty reliable is just going back to something that we looked at earlier in the week, and that's the sectoral structure of an economy. In other words, are the majority of jobs within your country primary, tertiary, or secondary? Yeah, as you can see from the chart here on the screen, countries where the vast majority of their jobs are in the primary sector, this is an indication of a less developed country in LDC, and you can see that on the graph here, right? Whereas countries that industrialized for a while, the secondary sector is the biggest in that place, right? And then over time, as you can tell from this graph, that moves over time. Over time, the tertiary sector becomes really the leading sector, and there's even a drop off in the secondary sector, that being manufacturing. In the end, we talked about this with the state of Georgia just the other day, right? That this was essentially the trend here. So there it is. Another way to measure development that's interesting is looking at income distribution. Less developed countries are generally going to have a wider gap between rich and poor, what we call essentially uneven development, within states. We generally will measure uneven development within states with a measurement called the Gini coefficient, GINI. And what it does is it measures the extent to which the distribution or income or consumption expenditure amongst individual households within an economy deviates from perfect equal distribution. You don't need to write all that out. What you do need to understand is that a Gini index of 0 indicates perfect equality, and a Gini index of 100 implies perfect inequality. Of course, you're not going to see either in any given country, but the idea is that the closer to 0 that you get, the less income gap there is between your richest and poorest, and the closer that you get to 100, the more income gap there is. You see some huge income gaps there in much of the developed world when you look at this particular map. You also see the least amount of gap actually in Central and Northern Europe, and also in Japan. So that's interesting. This is a very, very key measurement when it comes to just uneven development and understanding uneven development in a country. Brazil, China, and Mexico are three countries that fall sort of in the middle of the pack in GNI per capita and other economic indicators. But all three of these countries have a GNI per capita that's greater than 150% of the national average in some provinces and less than 75% of the national average in others. For example, if you take a look at Brazil here on the bottom right of your screen, where do you see wealth highest? Actually along the coast, right? And the lowest in the interior region of the Amazon. So Brazil experiences quite a bit of rather uneven development. In China, wealth is highest among the Atlantic coast, or I'm sorry, on the East Coast, the Pacific coast. Got my countries mixed up there for a second. Been a long week. Wealth is highest on the East Coast, right on the Pacific coast of China, and the lowest in the mountain and desert. I've always said throughout the year there's really two Chinas, and you see kind of evidence of this on the map. China is a country that experiences quite a bit of uneven development. Mexico's another great example of this. Wealth is relatively high in the border region, believe it or not, especially around the city of Monterrey. In the Yucatan Peninsula, also, there's a really dark dot there in the middle of Mexico. That's Mexico City. But then you see in the south of the country, very, very low GDP per capita statistics, right? So when you see this type of uneven development, this is usually a sign of kind of less developed country status as a whole, or lesser development. And let's be realistic, poverty is not confined to the periphery, right? More developed countries have regions that are markedly more poor than others. Yeah. Indian reservations in the United States, for example, have 80% unemployment, 60% of people living in poverty, and a per capita income of $6,000 or less. Okay. So, versus if you go to New England, the GNI per capita is about 120% what the national average is. Yeah. So, uneven development is definitely something that we look at, and that's an indicator of whether a country is more developed or less developed as well. Finally, fertility rates can always be a good measurement of development in a country, right? Countries with lower fertility tend to be more developed. Countries with higher fertility tend to be less developed, as you probably remember from the population unit. Same rule goes for infant mortality rates, right? Countries with lower infant mortality rates it's a good sign of higher levels of development because they can afford better health care. And countries with higher infant mortality rates is generally going to be a sign of less development. Access to health care, right? Like physicians per population. Yeah. You're going to see in areas where there's more physicians per population, better access to health care, generally an indicator of a higher level of development. When you have less physicians per population, you see in parts of Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East, much of Central and Southern and Western Africa, then that's an indicator of less development as well. Something that I don't have a map for, but it is interesting to look at is the use of fossil fuels versus renewable energy. Countries that are using more renewable energy options tend to be more developed. Countries that are using more traditional fossil fuels is an indicator of less development. And finally, literacy rates. Literacy rates actually tell quite the story. Some would say of development. Literacy rates are 99% in developed countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, you're looking about 70%. In Latin America, about 90%, depending on the region. But the issue with literacy rates is that the bar is pretty low, right? Literacy is that you can read and write. So there are some better indicators of education, and we're going to look at those indicators tomorrow because ultimately, the very best measurement that we have of of development is something known as the Human Development Index. And it's something that we'll talk about tomorrow in greater detail because it's a composite index that really kind of combines several factors. And it's the index that the United Nations uses, and it's one that we like a lot, and we'll take a look at that tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day today.